Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get us started right on time here today since we have a lot to discuss. It's my privilege to welcome you to today's event, Demographic Decline, National Crisis, or Moral Panic, here at the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here, and I'm really glad that we've got such a great panel and what I think will be a really interesting discussion for you today. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and moderators, starting on the far right over here, which is purely a positional statement, with Nick Eberstadt, the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy here at AEI, where he researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development. He also has a thing or two to say about North Korea from time to time, which we can, if things get really slow today, we can get into that. Man of diverse interests. He's testified before Congress on numerous occasions and has served as a consultant and advisor to various units of the U.S. government. And in 2012, Nick was awarded the prestigious Bradley Prize. Next to him is Philip Cohen, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. He has a long-standing interest in gender, family, and social change. And in particular, he has published extensively on the gender division of labor within families and between men and women outside of families. In addition, he's maintained a strong interest in measurement issues in household and family structure. Phil, welcome to AEI. And Lyman Stone, next, is an adjunct fellow here at AEI and also a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. He blogs about migration, population dynamics, and regional economics at his blog In a State of Migration. He also writes regularly for Vox's The Big Idea and for The Federalist, and his work has been extensively covered in the New York Times, Post, Wall Street Journal, and many other places. And our fearless moderator today is Carlin Bowman, a senior fellow here at AEI, where she compiles and analyzes American public opinion on a wide variety of issues ranging across all economic and social topics. In addition, she has long publicly commented on the evolution of American politics through the lens of key demographic and geographic changes. So please join me today in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and I'd also like to add my welcome to everyone here and to our C-SPAN audience today. Demographic change has been much in the news in the last week. Those of you who spent 7 hours listening to the CNN debate on climate change heard a question from the audience to Bernie Sanders, who was asked whether or not he would talk about the population explosion and its relationship to climate change. He said, in fact, that would be part of his campaign. And at the other end of the rhetorical spectrum, Elon Musk gave an interview to Jack Ma at an Alibaba forum on artificial intelligence, in which he said the biggest threat to the world going forward was not the population explosion, but demographic winter and population collapse. I think the truth is probably somewhere in between these two rhetorical extremes, but it is certainly true if you look at some of the data over the last 50 years. I think at that 50 years ago, 8 countries were below, total fertility rate was below replacement. That's now nearly 100 countries. We're going to turn to Lyman Stone first, and then Phil Cohen, and then Nick Eberstadt is cleanup, batting cleanup. Each of them are going to speak for about 8 minutes. And then perhaps I'll ask a question if we have time, and then we'll turn to all of your questions. Let's begin. Lyman.
All right. So my question is basically, we framed this as, is it a national crisis or a moral panic? So basically, is it a big deal? Is demographic decline a big deal, or is it not? So I'm going to argue it's a big deal. In fact, it is worse than you think. And the main way I'm going to do this is by comparing to, well, what do you think it is right now? And my benchmark is the Census Bureau. What does the Census Bureau think is going to happen in their most recent population forecast? I could have shown you the Congressional Budget Office, the Social Security trustees, any of these groups, but they're basically pretty much all very similar to this. And what you can see is the census says growth continues, right? It maybe slows down a little bit towards the middle of the century, but basically this is a business as usual scenario. So, shouldn't we just trust that? If that's what census says, don't they know? I'm going to argue that actually they're wrong. So the first reason they're wrong is because they greatly overestimate births. So Census's forecast was published in 2017, but the most recent finalized data they had was 2016. We now have the great fortune of final 2017 and 2018 data. We can see how accurate they were in those first 2 years. They were really inaccurate. They overestimated births by 220,000 babies. So that's a lot. We can see the same thing in deaths, that they underestimated deaths. So a lot of this is about deaths of despair, as they're labeled, opioids, suicide, alcohol. They they underestimated deaths considerably. And finally, on net migration, their error here was much smaller, but they did overestimate net migration in these years as well. When you correct for these errors, you get their 2018 population number versus their own 2018 estimates. So they have an estimate system and a forecasting system that are separate. Their 2018 population forecast, 1 year after it was published, was 724,000 people too high, which is a larger error than is generally considered permissible, let's say, in a private forecasting market. So if we correct for those errors, if we use the same assumptions about future trends and all this stuff, and mortality and life expectancy change, and we just change the intercept, just where we start from, the yellow line is what we get. 34 million fewer Americans in 2060. That trajectory looks very different. That's a meaningful decline in growth rates. So you start to say, oh, okay, right here, if I stop, we've kind of proved the point. The consensus view of what is going to happen is wrong. It is too optimistic. Growth will be much lower than you might think. But I want to go farther. I want to tell you that not only that, but the assumptions that guide that future trajectory are incorrect as well. So we can look at different fertility assumptions. So I've got just the historic total fertility rate, which is a bit of a concocted number, but it's basically if birth rates by age stayed consistent over a woman's whole lifespan, how many babies would she have? This number is never quite accurate, right? Because birth rates change, but it's a reasonable enough indicator. So we can see that blue line at the bottom with the dots if fertility rates fall to 1.4 children per woman, which is like Italy or Japan or Hungary. And then we can see at the top, like what if fertility rose to 2.2, which is the highest it would have been since 1971. So this should give us a lot of different population scenarios to work with. And the base scenario is assuming some degree of fertility recovery over the next several decades. And what we see is that there's a 60 million person difference between the highest and lowest scenarios in 2070. That lowest fertility scenario actually gets you population decline by the middle of the century, which I don't think most people are saying, yeah, by the 2050s, population will be declining. We just won't need this many houses. I don't think the real estate market is planning for that. At the highest end, you're higher, but it's worth noting, even if you assume this unrealistic increase in fertility up to 2.2, you still don't get to Census's own forecast. Their error was just too big. So we can do the similar, and then we can look at fertility by race. And it's worth mentioning, a lot of times, fertility, when we talk about low fertility, people say, well, like Steve King said, like we can't continue the culture with other people's babies. Like there's this dichotomy between our babies and other people's babies. But when I talk about declining fertility, what's the line you see here? It's Hispanic babies. It's Hispanic mothers. That's the big decline in fertility. And if we look at people's fertility, their achieved fertility versus their desires, the biggest shortfall, and the desires are from the General Social Survey here, which I believe Phil will also cite, basically, the people with the biggest shortfall in fertility, they're not non-Hispanic white women. It's African American women and Asian women and Native American women. So if fertility is to increase in America, it will almost certainly be disproportionately non-white fertility. So when I talk about rising fertility, or do we want fertility to rise, we're mostly talking about non-white fertility. This isn't really about what's going to happen to white fertility, which has been pretty stable for a long time. So ultimately, higher birth rates, more diversity. And you can also do this out in a population model and see it pan out. So let's go to migration. We can look at different migration scenarios. What if migration falls? What if it rises? As you can see, it has been falling for several decades. And again, there's a 40 million person population difference. It's a big difference, but again, even that high scenario where immigration rises by a third, which should be a big change, doesn't get you to the census's current forecast. We can also look at deaths. So one way to express deaths is life expectancy. We can say, what if, recently life expectancy has been falling because of, again, deaths of despair. What if we get really bad at dealing with deaths of despair? What if they spread? What if our health system gets more and more dysfunctional? That's that green line. Or at the top, what if we get really good life extension technologies and we deal with deaths of despair and all this? What effect does it have? It's a huge effect. In fact, the only way really to get to Census's current forecast is to assume that life expectancy is going to rise considerably. However, while that might sound like a rosy scenario, we can then look at the population share by age. So yeah, we have a lot of people in that scenario, and very few of them are working age. So great, population growth, maybe that's lovely, but there will be problems associated with that as well. Which means really fertility and immigration are your two channels for population growth with a more stable age mix. So you can see that in all those other lines in the middle. They don't really change the age mix a whole lot. So what's really going to happen? I've given you all these scenarios. I've talked very quickly with lots of graphs. So first we can think about immigration. What is actually likely to happen? Fertility rates are declining in the countries that have historically sent immigrants to America. Mexico, much of Latin America. East Asia is developing very rapidly. The push for migration is less there as well. India is almost below replacement rate fertility now. May actually be. Africa, fertility is declining very quickly as well. And also we don't get a lot of immigrants from Africa yet, unfortunately. Meanwhile, there are more rich countries opening to migration. The foreign-born share of population in Europe is rising very rapidly. It's also rising in Japan. It's also rising in Korea. There are more and more developed countries saying, hey, we're aging. We want to offset this with immigration, which is a reasonable strategy. But it gets harder as global fertility rates decline and the number of potential destinations rises. Right? So at some point, this gets more and more challenging. And finally, there's a US policy question. Can we count on immigration policy remaining open and stable forever? I think most of us know the answer is no. As much as I personally would very much like that, I'd like a lot more immigration, it's unlikely that our policy mix will be perpetually open to high levels of immigration, as we can see in current changes right now. Then with fertility, it's a bit less concrete. We can say, well, cost of childbearing is rising. The opportunity cost of childbearing is rising in terms of lost wages and time out of work. There's also this question of these ultra-low fertility rates. I'm calling it Europeanization here. There's lots of different terms that are used. But will we drift into a new paradigm where people just only want one kid? We're not there. Maybe we will get there. With mortality, this is one where I think there's a real case for pessimism. In case you can't tell, that's usually my attitude here. But deaths of despair are not declining. And we're not really pioneering a way to deal with this. In fact, we're seeing a geographic spread. And many large parts of the country still have very low rates of death in these areas, which means there's a lot of upside potential for deaths of despair. So, what's going to happen? It'll be worse than you thought. It'll be worse than any of our current forecasting agencies are expecting. All of our long-term budget planning is wildly optimistic in terms of what is actually going to happen with population. I would say thank you. However, that is a dark note to end on, but it is where I'm ending.
So you're welcome.
Phil.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're
Perfect
welcome.
8
I'm
minutes.
done.
Great. Oh, perfect segue. I hope this is on. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here and participate in this conversation. I actually will have some of my own projection graphs also, which will be simpler. But I'll make a couple of political points first. I have to advance it on here and on here so I can have my notes. There's a lot of in the American right, there's a lot of kind of mumbo jumbo about demographic decline, with these sort of mystical statements like the health of the nation is measured by whether or not we're having that's not a measurable. There's no health of a nation. So you might think that places with higher birth rates are better off than places with lower birth rates. That's totally wrong. So it sort of has this kind of it has this sort of emotional charge to it. And you might think there's nothing really wrong with just making sort of banal statements like children are good or whatever. But in the case of America, these throwaway lines that are not associated with real numbers and measures and so on have real consequences. This is from the guy who shot up the mosques in New Zealand. Birth rates, birth rates, birth rates. We have to get the birth rates to change no matter what we do. This is the number one thing. So the demographic decline crisis, and I'm absolutely not putting this on Lyman, appeals to white supremacists a lot. In the same way that states' rights appeals to racists in America a lot. You might be able to make a non-racist argument about it, but you can't sort of ignore the coincidence that a lot of racists really like what you're saying. And so it's, I mean, you can, but it's kind of, I'm suggesting it's kind of irresponsible. So we have to deal with that association between this idea of demographic decline and the political implications of it. And they're not so hard to imagine. This is the census forecast, okay? So the scale here may be off, but the gist of it is that the white population is pretty much there, or is going to increase a little bit more. This starts in 1970. I noticed, by the way, Lyman's early graph started in 1800, which gives you a really sense of like...
I like the long time series.
Right, but it gives you, it kind of throws off the way you look at the current situation. Or at least you just have to keep it in mind. If you are concerned about the composition of the US population from a racist perspective, there's a lot of material to work with here, basically, in the projections and in the future where we're heading. I want to suggest, though, that as an actual problem of demographic decline, it's really, the solution is really right in front of us, which is immigration. And if people don't like it, or it's politically not feasible or whatever, then that's the problem. The problem is not the lack of people. The problem is the lack of wanting to let people into the country. And if the problem is you want a certain kind of people, and it's a cultural problem, and you're worried about who is going to come and so on, then essentially now it's even harder to disassociate yourself from the racist perspective. So good luck. When you look at the longer term composition of immigrants, you can see why there's a political problem, especially on the racist right, with immigration, which is the composition of immigrants, which is now the great majority is from Latin America and Asia, increasing but very small share from Africa. The question of is immigration good is very different from the question of, or what is the correct immigration policy, from the question of is immigration policy good for America or good for us as opposed to them or something like that. I'm not a politician. I'm not elected to represent an American constituency or something, so I don't have to set my moral horizon arbitrarily to end at the US border. So I think a lot of people want to come here. Immigration is good for them. That's good. America may have issues to work out with that, and I wish America luck. I'm happy to help. But it's not a moral given that the issue we have to do is figure out how to make this good for America. I just want to make that point, just to be preachy. Okay, now a little bit of more demography. I think the fear is overblown. It's even if you take everything Lyman said that we're not going to meet the census projections, and that may have big implications for our budget planning and so on, the idea of population decline is a long way off. Demographic decline is really a scary made-up term, and we're not having population decline anytime soon. When people say demographic decline, they often include amorphous things like, well, we've had a little decline, unprecedented and completely terrible, little decline in life expectancy, and the birth rate is falling, therefore we have demographic decline. But just keep it in perspective that we're not talking about population decline. Italy, Spain, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom all got to below replacement fertility in the 1970s, and their populations are not declining. Italy, maybe a tiny bit. And eventually, if they don't have immigration, it will happen, because that's what the replacement number means. But it doesn't mean decline right now. So just keep that in perspective. These are birth cohorts, and it's their completed fertility, their cumulative fertility. And so I hope you can see, oh, that's nice and big. The darkest line is the people born, and the women born in 1960. They got to just about 2 births per woman by the time they got to 45. The next cohort 5 years later had a little bit more. The 1970 cohort got up a little bit higher. The 1975 cohort higher still, and then it's really after that we start to have this issue. But But if you can look at that line that's squeaking up in between there, that's the first bunch of so-called millennials, a term I don't use scientifically, but just for reference. The people born around 1980, and you can see if you could parse out those lines, they started out lower and then they caught up a little. So now they're actually ahead of the 70, 65 and 60 generation at that time in their life. So you can see essentially what's happening with them is some evidence of delay and catch up. And we're in the range of 1 to 2 babies per woman. Catching up in your 30s is not impossible at all, right? If we were talking about the difference between 6 and 2, then catch up becomes a biological issue. But those last 2 lines are what's troubling Lyman, which is that they're both well below the previous cohorts. And the unknown question is if they turn the corner like a hurricane, so to speak, and the projection ends up tracking them further north, then we'll never get a cohort that doesn't replace itself. We have not yet had a cohort of women that did not replace themselves. Okay, a couple of projections. I'm probably running late on time.
No, you're fine.
Take your time.
You're fine.
Okay, a couple of projections. And these are not census projections, although I use their projection tool, which is excellent. And if you go to my blog, Family Inequality, you can find the link. I'll put it up tomorrow. You can play with these numbers yourself. So the line that heads down is if you take just today's birth rates and today's death rates and nothing else, and you just run those numbers, then we would lose 100 million people by the end of the century in terms of total population. Okay, so that's the disaster scenario that's very bad. However, if you just add the current level of migration, if you just take the census numbers, not their estimates, but their reported, not their projections, but their estimates for immigration by age and sex, and you plug that in every single year, as if we continue to have about 1 million immigrants per year, then that essentially solves the entire problem of declining population. Okay? And it reduces the percentage of the population that is old by the end of the century, you can see from 25 to 23. So it does a little bit on aging, and it stops the population decline. Okay, now that America is going to look pretty different, you might want to think about that. Okay, that previous one, those orange lines which are still there, assumes no increase in mortality. No, I'm not assuming a decrease, in, a crash in mortality either, but that just assumes mortality goes on the way it is. And I had a little trouble with the software, so I just plugged in Japan, current Japan, for the US in 2080. We can dream that we have Japan's life expectancy, what they have now by 2080. Okay, if we get there, then you can see both numbers rise a little. That's not doing so much in the forecast. And finally, I didn't do Lyman's disaster scenario of total fertility falling all the way down to 1.4, but if you let it fall to 1.6, either by 2030 or 2050, it doesn't make that much of a difference in the light of the increasing life expectancy and immigration. So I'm not seeing the disaster in terms of total numbers basically anytime soon. So you can go back to worrying about the climate. I want to point out, I like to show this one, although this one's informative, but it doesn't show you everything. So these are not birth rates, these are changes in birth rates by age since 1989. And I just want to put this in perspective. So the darkest line are 15 to 17-year-olds, and the next one 18 to 19. So basically, fertility is falling for younger women and rising for older women on a percentage basis, right? Of course, those numbers in the 40 to 44 are still quite low, but the percentage rise has been very rapid. So basically, our whole fertility regime is shifting from earlier birth to later birth, right? People talk like the teen birth rate is its own thing. Like we monitor the teen birth rate. Is it up? Is it down? It's down. That's great. But this is all part of, these are the same women, right? So there's one trend, which is rising age at birth. And this has mostly been good. This has mostly been because women have more opportunities. So they've been doing other things instead of having children, and it's mostly good for those children. It also comes with later marriage, which is associated with lower odds of divorce and other better outcomes for children. So the idea that if you start mucking around with fertility, it has to come in here somewhere. So where are you going to get those more births if we want to raise fertility? Well, I assume nobody wants more births under age 20. no one in respectable policy circles. So it can't be those. And then people start getting nervous at the higher ages. So you have to realize, you're talking about now the age, increasing birth rates for the group of women who are taking advantage of the improvements for women that we have had in terms of education and career and so on. So women mostly want this, and it's mostly been good. However, it is true, and this is the General Social Survey data, that there is an increasing share of people who, when they reach age 40, if you ask them how many children have you had, and then you ask them separately, what is your ideal? What do you think is the ideal number of children for a family to have? You get about 25% of people that ideal number they give you is higher than the number they had. This absolutely does not mean that something has gone wrong in their lives. Okay? Other things may have gone so great that they put that one ideal aside, right? So, or if you treat children as a luxury, you could put it in the category of, well, how many boats do you think everybody should have? Well, I think everybody should have one at least. I have none, and I probably never will. And so, but that doesn't mean my life is a failure. It means I have things I didn't achieve that I sort of hoped I would achieve. So it's worth it. We just have to take, if you really want to study the question of is there something going wrong in people's lives? And that would be concerning in a different way than the question of the economic health of the country and the future and so on. But does this indicate, sort of in the J.D. Vance way, that something is deeply troublingly wrong with our society? People are not having the number of children that they want to have. That would be a problem, but I don't think this necessarily shows it. And so we'd have to look at the choices that people actually made in order to understand whether or not the trade-offs were overall advantageous. Okay, I'll just make a couple of wrap-up points. What is the prospect of sort of pronatal policy in the United States? It's not very good. And the reason is because it's very hard to design a policy that you could, and now here I'm not a political expert, but it's hard to make a pronatal policy that's not going to end up leading to more of the wrong kind of people being born from the point of view of the people who make policy. Right? You can't really, it's hard to design a pronatal policy that's not going to make more poor women and women of color have more children, and that's not really what they have in mind. So I don't really see it really in the cards, which is one of the reasons why I think the political talk about demographic decline and sort of the crisis atmosphere is bad, because I don't think it leads to a positive policy outcome, but I do think it inflames the racist right, and that's a shame. Okay, a quick other number two. If you're trying to, is it social engineering? I thought conservatives were against social engineering. People are choosing how many children they want to have. Isn't that good? When poor women were trying to have children that the American right didn't think they could afford to have, they were very comfortable punishing them by taking away their welfare. And yet when richer women decide that they don't want to have don't want to have children that somebody else thinks they might want to have, all of a sudden this is a national crisis. They're not being able to achieve their fertility. And finally, and we don't have to go into this direction, but if what we're trying to do is help women achieve their fertility goals and families. We want families to be able to have the number of children that they want to have, because that's what is good for a good society does, and that's what healthy people do, and that's what a government does that's supporting its people. Then I think it's really great, and it's a shame that some of the people who hold that position are prevented by their deeply held moral and religious convictions from similarly advocating for reproductive freedom for those same people when they try to have fewer children. And so that's also sort of a contradiction in this debate. But that's a tangent, and I'm done. Thank you.
Nick.
So I'm going to try to make 3 points. Point number one, if I were able really accurately and really robustly to forecast future fertility trends for the United States and future immigration trends for the United States, we wouldn't be meeting in this lovely auditorium. We'd be meeting on my palazzo, or we'd be meeting on my 400-foot yacht. But there's a reason that these projections have always been error-prone. And the reasons are that there is no robust really reliable method yet, as long as human beings have volition, for long-term forecasts of fertility trends. And it's just the same, it's actually worse with immigration trends because they're so intrinsically political. So I don't know if we are going to reach a peak Americans in the next generation. I don't know if we're going to have the US population shrink. I don't know if it's going to reaccelerate. I just don't know. The second thing, however, is that in this world of necessary ignorance, I have been very skeptical for all of my career in the scare stories about the population explosion, and I'm also pretty skeptical about population decline as being a necessary catastrophe for societies. My view is that population change is a form of social change, and some places deal with social change better than other places. If you have prepared and relatively intelligent policies, you can probably deal with social change better than if you don't. But that gets us to kind of the question of where the US may be heading. And my third point is this. I can imagine a future for the United States where total population is shrinking and where overall society is graying, where median age is increasing, and where the proportion of people over 65 or whatever you call old is going to be rising, where the society is becoming increasingly prosperous, where prosperity coincides with smaller populations and older populations. But we're not on this path right now. We are on a very worrisome path if we should ever hit this population shrinking inflection point. And certainly it is a troubling path considering the gradual social aging that's occurring in all of the affluent societies. And I'll show you what I mean here. Okay, so number one, for a shrinking and aging society to prosper, you need to have high rates of labor force participation. I'm just looking at the situation with guys in the US now. The situation with women is a little bit better, but not a whole lot better. Last week's job report showed that the employment to population ratios for guys 25 to 54, if you like 20 to 64 better, it doesn't matter which you choose, they're about the same as were reported in the 1940 US Census. And the census was asking people a question about the previous year, which is 1939. So we're basically at about 1939 levels of employment rates for at least the guys. Not what you would want if you were about to head into shrinking and aging land. We can look a little bit closer at this. You could say that maybe this is a problem of lack of demand for jobs and so forth. And that certainly, you could make that argument right after the Great Recession. But we've had a steady increase in the number of unfilled positions in the US, and they're not all for hedge fund managers and chemical engineers. A couple of million of those jobs are for people in the leisure industry, hotel, restaurateurs, construction workers. You've got to be strong for that, but you don't necessarily have to have an advanced degree. And yet, the total number of guys who are out of the labor force hasn't really moved that much since the crash itself. So there's something going on here that doesn't look so good, especially in the prospect of an eventually shrinking and already aging society. Okay. One of the things that you'd want for an aging society is healthy aging. This is not what we see right now with the mortality trends for the conventionally defined working age population. We've just lost a decade of health progress in the United States, and this only takes us up to 2017. Health progress, by the way, wasn't so hot in the couple of decades right before this, but now we're on the other end, the J end of the curve, and that's not what we would want either. Education. This is the proportion of 20-somethings in the US from the 60s to now who have bachelor's degrees or higher. Notice again what's happened with the guys. The proportion of guys with bachelor degrees in their late 20s is actually a little bit lower in, like, let's say, 2010 than it was in the 1970s. Part and parcel of preparing for a healthy aging society is increasing educational attainment. I mean, it would be nice if people learned things too while they were in school, but at least increasing educational attainment you might think is a sine qua non. So that's yet another thing that is problematic for the United States in dealing with these future problems. Okay, so then the final thing has to do with immigration. Now, is immigration a deus ex machina for the US? I would say that so far immigration has been pretty great for the US, and American newcomers have been assimilated into loyal and productive new Americans in, of course not perfect, but you have to say, compared to other things, it looks pretty good. But Phil, you may disagree with me about this, but I would say what we see here in Europe is not what I would want to see in the US. These are three different, this is what's going on more or less now in the EU. And what I'm showing you here are three lines showing the proportion of younger people who are neither employed nor in education or training. And the lowest line in the EU countries are for the native-born EU 28 people. Then there's a slightly higher line that is for, I guess, other EU people. And then the highest line of all are people who were born elsewhere outside of the EU. And when I see this, this looks to me like people aren't assimilating into the, into the kind of the human capital that these societies are going to need for the future. Now, I would say that so far we have dodged this bullet. And I hope we will continue to dodge this bullet, but I don't have any sense of complacency or hubris about thinking that we can do this permanently. So, here endeth the sermon.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to all of you for very thoughtful presentations. We've been discussing immigration, and first, Phil, I'd like to ask you whether you do disagree with Nick about the last point that he's just made about the problems of assimilation, and then I want to return to immigration.
Well, I was just trying to overlay from memory what that looks like in the U.S. I don't think we have a case of immigrants having twice the unemployment rates of right.
No, it's lower. I mean, the labor force participation is higher in every ethnic group.
I mean, and I'm surprised. So now I don't know enough about Europe to read this graph, but I might suspect I don't know what's going on with that. Gender would be an issue. Would be my first cut on that and see. But for the question of what happens to the sort of receiving society when you have a lot of immigration is a very big question. Also, what happens to the immigrants? I sort of, in one sense, if you reduce the border to basically a checkpoint where you check for arrest warrants and otherwise let people in, a lot of people would come, and they would come until coming wasn't good anymore, and then they would until it wasn't better. So sort of I used to think about this just in terms of like the U.S. and Mexico when most of the undocumented immigration was from Mexico. If you combined the U.S. and Mexican populations and you just redrew the border around both countries, the average income for the U.S. area would be lower, the average income for the Mexico area would be higher, and eventually would even out. I think that's basically fine. I think the issue is, do you have some, besides our own self-interest, which is, people care about that, is there something very special about America that must be preserved, that would be at risk from people who didn't share its cultural background coming here in large numbers? I admit that's an open question. I think it could also go the other way, though, and you could end up with a net positive in terms of culture change, of course. So. That's not an answer to your question.
Yeah. Large countries are clearly competing for immigrants. You've all talked or alluded to that. What
It's
should
kind of
the
like a
US
silent auction, though. I mean, are we really competing for immigrants?
Well, that's true. That's a good point. That's well taken. But what should a U.S. immigration policy look like? And this is one of the areas where in my little part of the world, in public opinion polls, we see deeper disagreements, I think, than perhaps in any others. There was a new poll this morning from the Chicago Council that showed that I think 79%, or I wrote this, 78% of Republicans said that large number of immigrants and refugees represented a critical threat to the vital interests of the United States, compared to 19% of Democrats. But more importantly, what should a U.S. immigration policy look like? Lyman, you want to start?
Oh boy.
It's a big one.
I mean, I think when I look at this graph that's up here right now, I wonder if it looked different in 1999. And what I mean by that is, or in 2004, in some prior period, that is, I wonder how much, in the US we are very fortunate that most of our immigration is coming essentially as labor immigration. That we say, you're either here for education or you're here for work. And even if you come on a family visa, your family member came for work, and often they're motivated to get you into work as well, also because we don't have a very generous public support system. And that has also been true historically for European immigration. Very recently, it hasn't been. Europe changed from a country that accepted, or from a continent really, that accepted in total something like a fifth or a sixth as many crisis migrants as we did, to one that accepted 12 times as many. Historically, the US was the country that accepted lots of refugees and a lot of asylum seekers. And then, of course, crisis in Syria, Afghanistan, all these different sources changed that. And I think they didn't really know how to handle that. They didn't have a lot of experience with refugee resettlement. There's been a lot of difficult experimentation. And at the same time, asylum seekers are by definition intending to be temporary. So how much of what we see with European employment trends is people who, they intend this to be temporary during a crisis. Also, a lot of them don't have birthright citizenship, which we're blessed to have in the United States. How many of these people are stateless and legally cannot acquire employment? Luckily, we have institutions that promote integration in America. But I think that integration point is actually the point, is whatever your policy, all too often we talk about total numbers. I'm a demographer, I care about total numbers. They're important for the forecasts. But it also matters how they're received and the community that receives them. If we get 2 million immigrants into New York City and they are all French people, this will have a very different, it'll get a very different political response than if each town gets 2 or 3 more immigrants and they're all from different countries. Because these have different cultural impacts, these have different political impacts, these have different economic impacts. Getting people, having an immigration policy that encourages people to have a stake in immigration. Actually, I appreciated that Philip mentioned the great replacement conspiracy theory, right? That all too often, I think especially on the right, there is a rhetoric that immigrants are replacements. But we should be trying to find policy avenues to help people view them as reinforcements. That this is additional people contributing to your society and your culture. Now, I don't think our institutions do that right now. You can think about place-based visas, or the Canadian-style visa sponsorship system are all options for getting that. But you have to have a system that actually encourages a welcoming community to facilitate integration.
Yeah. Nick, a better immigration policy?
Well, first, for Phil's question, it's more extreme for females than for males, but it holds up for the males as well. At least with labor force participation. I can't say about the education and training part of it. Well, I mean, yes, it is certainly true that 95% of the planet would be financially better off if they moved to the USA. But the people who ultimately get to choose on who comes into any country are the people in the country. That's the national sovereignty, and it's like the voters. We had a very, very low level of immigration in the United States from the 20s until the 60s. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is what happened in the first Gilded Age in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, when we really did have, I mean, they weren't totally open borders because it was kind of expensive and hard and dangerous to get here. But we had pretty open immigration policies. We saw extremely big wealth differences and income differences develop in the United States. Does any of this sound familiar? And then among less skilled native-born Americans whose wages were arguably being depressed by less skilled immigrants coming in, there was a huge anti-immigrant movement that started in the 1890s and continued into the 1900s and started in different state houses all across the US. Got a couple of bills to Congress that didn't pass. And then we had this forcing event, and the forcing event was World War I, when people couldn't move anymore. And after that, we had a really radical restrictive policy go into place. I'd kind of like, I mean, maybe it's the Pareto optimality guy in me that would like to see a sort of a situation with winners and no losers, but I think that we may be closing our eyes if we think that there are no losers in the immigration situation. We have to figure, you don't want to be a politician, but we have to figure out a way that works for people, for the human beings who are living here already. And I don't know what the totals are, I don't know what the flow is, but it's not, I don't think it is out of bounds for people who think that their interests are being hurt to raise their hands and say, we've got a political process that's supposed to protect us too.
Philip, your reaction?
I'll just say something brief about that. Interesting that extreme partisan split is, you know, I'm skeptical about polls that go by partisan divide now because, at least according to Trump, 94% of Republicans support him, which makes me suspect that self-identification as a Republican is very tied up now with support for Trump. And so essentially what you have, if that's true, then you polled a group of members of an anti-immigration movement about what their views about immigration are. And so I think that's a problem. I think Lyman's point about community and reception is extremely well taken, and goes to your point also, Nick, as far as making immigration something that works both for you know, sort of senders and receivers. But it's interesting, you know, and I guess we could think about Japan a little.
Yeah.
You know, Japan may be having a proportional increase in immigration, but it's still pretty small, right?
Yeah.
Or at least it's not enough to address the population. I'll let you answer that in a second. But that was just rhetorical. If you're having a demographic crisis from low fertility, and you're having all the problems associated with demographic decline, economic stagnation, and lack of entrepreneurship, and all the things things that we're afraid of, and you refuse to allow immigrants in that would help with that problem, then immigration is not really your problem. Then your problem is something cultural in the society, which refuses to allow you to see the humanity in your neighbors in some vital way. And I think a key part of our problem now is to work on that problem, which is before we can get to a sane immigration policy, we may have to get to the point where Americans can recognize that the humanity in their neighbors.
Lyman, you had a response to that?
So I'll actually leave the Japan one because I don't know the stats off the top of my head. But just building on that a little bit, I think there is a sense. Well, again, to go back to sort of the tweet heard around the world from Steve King with this "other people's babies" comment, it really triggered something in this idea that is latent with some people that there's a substitution between our babies and their babies, that these are rivalrous goods. And I think we actually see this as well. Actually, there's an impetus in demographic forecasting to see these as rival goods, right? Because growth can come from one or the other. But practically speaking, the first wave of successful nativism that happened was coincident with the first time in American history that mortality adjusted fertility fell below 2.9. And it fell from about 3 to below 2 in about 10 years over the course of the 20s while this was happening. Now it's mortality adjusted. So it had been declining gradually, but it had been declining with child mortality. When people feel like their community is not going to survive, when people feel like it's threatened, whether by suicide or opioids or Genghis Khan invading horde, or because, my father-in-law's a pastor, as he would say, as funerals are outnumbering baptisms, it creates a feeling of threat. Is it legitimate? Is it not? It exists. People feel this. And so I think a vital part of creating a welcoming society for immigrants is fertility among people who live there. That is, it's saying, look, your community is not under threat. You have a future for your culture. You're going to hit the scale you need to keep supporting your church, your seminary, your school, whatever it is, your soccer league, whatever you value. This other community is going to join you and share these things. And so one of my big worries with low fertility, with declining fertility, is that we're going to have a society where 100% of population growth comes from immigration, and natives are aware of that. That is, that they will say, yeah, we're not okay with this. Our community is clearly not going to be persisted. People want to feel that they are part of a lasting, transcendent community. So we probably want the fertility rate to rise because we want intermarriage between natives and foreign-born. We want communities that can welcome people into a healthy, growing community. So
Done pretty well.
this is part of a welcoming community, is a community that also values what it has to share with people who are coming.
Well, Philip, you alluded to some of the problems of low fertility societies. They don't innovate, they can't sustain Social Security, they can't project power because they don't have the money to spend on defense. What are those really, do we have a lot of evidence on those points?
No. Those are the things people worry about.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the Social Security and the old age support obviously is very big. And one of the things that in Lyman's scenario would matter, if people having children wanted immigrants to help take care of their children. So like the care issues are very real. The issues of cultural vitality and all that stuff, I'm not sure if those are. I don't know if we really have the record to evaluate that. And don't ask me about projecting power. That's not my thing.
Just a thought. It's one of the arguments that's been made.
No, I know it has.
Other
And I
thoughts?
just don't want to, judge.
About other problems of low fertility societies that we haven't touched on? Other problems of low fertility societies that we haven't touched
Like
on?
China.
Yeah,
Yeah.
China, I mean,
Well, yeah.
China or Japan, in both, one of the things which we didn't mention is we're looking at kind of head counts. I mean, this is your thing, like the family arrangements, right? You have not just a changing head count in Japan and China, but you've got radically changing family and living arrangements. I mean, Japan, the projections I've seen, maybe you've seen other ones, suggest that Japan is on a path to seeing the current cohort of 20-somethings mainly end up without grandchildren. And how a society like that future Japan will function kind of like seems to me to get into kind of the science fiction portion of the program. I'm not imaginative enough to see how that's going to work. But so I think we really need to bear in mind not just the head count, but also kind of the living arrangements and the family structure too.
I think I read that Japan is, the people in Japan are actually renting children for just to be with them on the weekends because they have so many people who are single and so many people who are alone for these reasons. I want to touch on deaths of despair. You've all alluded to it, and I noticed that Senator Lee's committee last week, the Social Capital Project, tried to break down some of these statistics, arguing that suicide and alcoholism deaths are not significantly different from what they were at earlier parts of the last century, but the opioid addiction, obviously, and drug addiction has just soared. How do we address the deaths of despair? I mean, that's a very big question.
Anybody want to
No
take it
answer.
first?
I mean, one of my hobbies for a long time was looking at health trends in the Soviet Union and the other Warsaw Pact countries. And the stuff that we see today looks a little bit too close for comfort to, as a kind of an echo of the rising adult mortality trends that we saw back in those societies then. I never thought that I would live long enough to see life expectancy in East Germany higher than life expectancy in the United States, but then again, here we are today. If you look at if you think that you can look at that stuff as a sort of a mirror that reflects something on where we are, and there are many ways that it cannot, because it's a completely different political arrangement and many other different things as well. One of the things which I think that the public health community missed was the role of stress and psychosocial factors in that long-term health problem, in part because that was something that nobody was measuring. I have to wonder whether that isn't also part of what we're seeing here in the United States. We should have a much more responsive public health system, but in a way it's kind of astonishing to me that it took a decade and a half for American researchers and the life science community to realize that the low education, middle-aged Anglos were having this rise in death rates. It doesn't sound like that group was terribly well protected.
One final question before we turn to your questions, and that is, what pronatal policies have worked elsewhere? Things like birth bonuses, tax incentives, what turns these numbers around,
Yes.
if anything?
Anybody else want to take it?
I'll say just a little bit. There's some experience with that, the problem is you may be changing timing more than you're changing total numbers.
Yes.
You may be encouraging people to have their second or third child sooner, but basically the policies are some combination of child credits, paid leave, education, and so on. Things I would like. I don't know that. The history of countries tinkering with their fertility rates, I'm looking back at China, is not very good. It's hard to do that in a free society. If as far as we're talking about deaths of despair, if people were happier and healthier, if we just imposed a confiscatory wealth tax and built some infrastructure,
And open borders, right?
just a
Many
little
healthy people
infrastructure
come
and
in.
healthcare and education, they probably would have more children, but that wouldn't really be a pronatal policy. It would just be improving people's outlook.
So if I could speak in defense of pronatalism here. So it is true, most of what we observe from baby bonuses or these types of things is a timing effect. It's people shifting from having a baby at 29 to 25. However, as anyone who's done any demographic forecasting is aware, timing effects matter. In terms of the age of the population, in terms of the rate of growth of the population, if you can shrink the generational space by 3 or 4 years, this is actually a lot of population growth. This is, in fact, the trustees of the Social Security fund actually include a scenario where they just look at just changing median age, and it turns out it makes a lot of money for Social Security if we have the same amount of kids but have them ever so slightly earlier. Great, let's get a timing effect. This is good. This is good, especially when we're paying people for it. I agree with the concerns about tinkering with fertility policy gets you into really nasty space pretty quickly in a lot of cases. But when what we're talking about is a policy that will also reduce child poverty by like 95%, right? Just handing families a bunch of cash, basically. This is not a bad thing. And if it also compresses generational space slightly, if it reduces the gap between the children that women have and that they say they want to have, and if there's also some research, there's a little bit of cohort effect. It's not big, but particularly some recent research in Canada found a bit of a cohort effect, and there's one in Germany as well. If we increase total childbearing a little bit, great. Now, will a cash bonus do everything? No. And I'm sympathetic to the view that, deaths of despair, probably making a livable society is part of this, that having a functional educational and health system for families is part of this. But we may have different views about a confiscatory wealth tax to pay for it, but
I just like confiscatory.
it's just a great word, yeah. But a lot of these policies, they actually do have a track record of having some. It's modest, but having an effect. It costs some money. Surprise! If you would like to have birth rates that people want in a world where they want lots of things, you do have to pay for it. But it is a viable policy option, especially when combined with other higher leverage points like removing working class marriage penalties that are baked into our tax code, our welfare system. Working class families can face $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 penalties for getting married in terms of the benefits they lose. So no surprise their marriage rates are falling.
Yeah, Nick?
There's been all of this work done for a century on what are the correlates of fertility levels, and you can correlate like anything with this, and there are always these maddening exceptions to the rule. The one that I find most persuasive is wanted fertility levels, what women say they want as fertility levels. And we just saw it. They're not perfect. It's not a perfect indicator, but it's a lot closer than other ones. And it makes a certain amount of intuitive sense to me. If that is true, if the most important determinant is desired fertility, then we can ask all sorts of questions about what affects desired fertility, and then we're off in a big area of investigation and research. But if that is true, yes, maybe pronatal policy, voluntary pronatal policy can have some influence, but my impression is that even though it's a non-zero impact, it can be pretty expensive for pretty modest demographic impact.
Panel's covered an enormous amount of ground in a short time, and so now we're going to turn to your questions, and if you could wait for the microphone and identify yourself, please. First questions. Yes, right here.
Good afternoon. David Jimenez, Prison Fellowship. I don't mean to throw gasoline on fire on the gasoline here, but any thoughts on whether the decline, a possible connection between the decline of the so-called Fordist breadwinner model impacted fertility rates over the past few decades in the United States?
You probably looked at that closer than I have.
You mean, by Fordist, you mean breadwinner homemaker?
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about it?
A living wage,
Yeah.
I mean, a family wage paid to support a family with one paid worker who's the man. Did the decline of that model have to do with falling fertility? Probably. Would bringing it back raise fertility? A, I don't think you'll find out, and B, I don't think so.
Actually, there's efforts. There have been efforts on this direction in some East Asian countries, because they sort of had this theory. Now they've sort of gone with a new theory, but for a while their theory was basically we need to make sure that we have these well-paid salarymen. I mean, this word salaryman comes from the East Asian policy context, particularly Japan. There were efforts to reinforce it because it'll support families. It doesn't work because we live. The reason why this will surprise a lot of people. The reason why a lot of women are working is because they want to work, because they have career ambitions. Right? You're not just going to be able to pay the male breadwinner enough that those ambitions just don't exist. So you get a situation where you have high occupational closure, limiting who can work. And at the same time, a lot of people who want to, so you get a lot of inconsistent, unstable, bad jobs that don't really support families, and then a few people who make it big.
And actually, in the Japan case, because the family structure, and practices within families, the extreme gender differentiation and women not working, and because women didn't want that, I think that contributed a lot to the increasing age at marriage. In other words, that moment when you got married was basically the end, and you put that off as long as you could. So the policy in that case was not increasing fertility, it was decreasing fertility, because it meant, I'm exaggerating, but because it signaled extreme gender inequality, and women didn't really want to enter into that.
But if you look at total fertility rates in the U.S. since, this is period, not cohort. Okay, so a little bit cheating. But if you look at the period rates from like the mid '80s until the crash of '08, it was skirting or a little bit above 2.0. Now, of course, as you pointed out, Lyman, there was a differentiation between Latino and more or less everybody else, and that's come down. But the appreciable drop that we've seen, the end of American demographic exceptionalism, or whatever you want to call it, didn't come with the end, or it wasn't timed with the end of Fordism. It was timed with like the crash. And for a considerable period of time, I wasn't clear whether this was just postponing or whether this is a new norm. I think it's harder and harder after like 10 plus years to make the case that this is just postponing, because eventually if you postpone long enough, then you forego.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Santi Ruiz, I work here. I'm curious, are there housing or zoning policies that you guys think would have an impact on fertility rates? I know we've seen a lot of young couples moving out of city centers where they make more money in order to have children in the suburbs, but having to pay financial costs to do so.
So the USDA does this report every year where they look at the cost of raising a child. And what they really do is they look at how much money families with kids spend, and then they sort of statistically allocate it to the child. And if you look at the categories they break out, like housing, healthcare, childcare, all these different things, over the last 20 years, and then you compare it to price changes, like in the consumer price index and those categories, in pretty much every category, what has happened is that prices have risen and spending has risen by way more, right? That families are having materially better circumstances for their kids, they're spending more, it's not just price, except in housing, where the amount that families spend has risen considerably less than the cost of housing, than the price of housing, basically, which means families are having a real crunch. That is, we're actually seeing families with a severe housing stress, that their real housing consumption is declining. We see that now. Square footage of houses is falling and has been for like 15 years. And beyond this, commute times are rising even as more people are working from home, which suggests people are living farther and farther from work, having more and more miserable time in traffic jams. So this suggests there's a very real housing stress impacting families. I think you need density that allows people to live close to work, close to amenities, and that means removing barriers to that, whether they're formal zoning or they are just other use rules, or even in many cases building codes that make certain areas unbuildable, even though there is technology to build in them. So it's very important.
Other questions? No? I'm sorry, Michael? You wait for the microphone, and Michael.
Michael Barone with AEI and Washington Examiner. I didn't hear too much about where future immigrants are going to come from. I think that what we've seen over the last 10 years is that we have moved toward what President Trump says he's for, which is more high-skill, less low-skill immigration, and what Democrats nominally at least say that they're for. And that sort of happened because Latin immigration, particularly from Mexico, but also otherwise, has gone way downhill. We're getting more high-skill immigration probably from East and South Asia. Africa? Lyman has it on his graphs a little bit. We've got, there are some parts of Africa where population growth is not declining very much. You've got a reservoir of 160 million people in Nigeria. Immigrants that we've been getting from Africa, my understanding is, pretty high skill, pretty high education, Nigeria, Ghana. except from places where we've been getting refugees like Somalia. Here in we have many Ethiopians here. Are we going to see a surge in immigration from Africa? What might be the consequences, positive and negative, from that?
Well, we've got, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa, as you know, Mike, is the only big area of the world that's very much above net replacement. And, barring some sort of unimaginable catastrophe, that's not going to change over the next generation. So there's an increasing share, like close to 45% maybe, of the prospective, conventionally defined, working age manpower for the world as a whole is going to be coming from the sub-Sahara. And there are going to be a lot of people in that region who are going to be relatively high-skilled potential migrants around the world, even though there is, I think, a terrible education crisis underway for the sub-Sahara as a whole. I mean, there's the advance in educational attainment for the region is not increasing as fast as I think a whole lot of us would like. And improvement in educational attainment there wins on its own merits for what it does there. But it seems like a reasonable conjecture to imagine that there would be more high-skilled migrants globally from the sub-Saharan region. Would it be easier to head to Europe? Would it be? Maybe. But we've had a pretty good track record, I think, with African migrants in the United States since '65.
We will probably get more African migrants in the future, which is great. Like, as mentioned, they actually have some of the best observed integration records in terms of speed with which their income, employment, education converges. Their children do quite well here. With literally the one exception being some Somali communities where there were also administrative issues in resettlement programs in some cases that go back many decades. But I don't think it's going to be a huge surge because there's only a couple ways to get here. An education visa, and the African middle class is growing and will continue to do so, but not fast enough and not with good enough education to be producing an enormous amount of admissions into American universities. Work visa, which is difficult to get if you don't have a network already, right? Not a lot of companies not a lot of companies just say, hey, let's send a recruiter to Nigeria. Maybe they should, but that's not happening right now. Or refugee migration. But actually, more and more African countries are effectively managing crises locally, which is wonderful. But that means there's actually less resettlement demand from some of these countries. And then you get your fourth channel that really is not an option, which is undocumented arrivals. But there's no land border, and obviously the maritime, aside from a few container smuggling situations, you're not going to get mass migration there. So I just don't think, I wish that there were a serious effort to recruit the next generation of Americans in sub-Saharan Africa. We should be doing it. It would be smart. Aside from what it would do for us in terms of the diplomatic connection in a region that China is competing in. But that's not what we're doing. We're not establishing a visa program to recruit high-skilled sub-Saharan Africans. It's not where we are right now.
Is there one final question? I'm sorry, there are actually two. Let's put both of them on the table, first in the back and then right here.
Hi, Amy McEwen. I'm a financial analyst. I was just curious, someone briefly mentioned the high net worth late reproduction rates, but I did not see that presented anywhere. I see mixed anecdotal evidence that there are smaller high net worth families and then larger high net worth families, suggesting that maybe the high net worth has not adjusted the way other parts or other income groups have. So I'm just curious what that statistic looks like.
And then if we could also get this question too.
Conrad?
What?
Right. Pardon? Is there one other?
was going to say Conrad Hackett in the back was from the Pew Research Center. I had a question, I thought.
Okay,
Well,
please
maybe
go.
we can
you.
get these two.
My name is Catherine Francois. I work at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. Just a follow-up to the kind of breadwinner, homemaker question earlier. It seems at least anecdotally that in the workplace there are a lot more like flexible working arrangements, paid maternity leave, things like that, that maybe weren't in place when women first entered the workforce. And I'm wondering if maybe the decline in fertility that happened when women first started entering the workforce might kind of reverse as there are more arrangements like that give people those options.
Did I overlook someone? Was there?
Conrad with the glasses.
Oh, I'm
in the
sorry,
back.
right there.
Conrad Hackett, Pew Research Center. My question is, given that demographic change makes people worry, do you think the American public would be better served by having a more complete understanding of the dynamics that you've talked about? Or is ignorance bliss? Is it better that they don't understand the change underway?
You can take, any of you could take any of those questions.
Go ahead.
Oh, I don't know the answer to the high net worth question. The only survey that would get at it would be the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is a data set that I don't touch with a 9-foot pole because it's very complicated to use. And the other surveys aren't gonna hit that group of people very well. Generally, very wealthy people do have higher fertility because they can afford it. And so they tend to achieve their desires, so to speak. But has that changed? I don't know.
Quickly,
On the issue of is ignorance better, I think the panic about immigration right now is greater than the panic about demographic decline. I kind of feel like if I'm an educator. I feel like it would be better if people understood the true story. That would have to include the story of immigration, what it actually is, who the immigrants are, what it means to them, and what it means for Americans when they come here. I do think, obviously no one is going to advocate for ignorance, but I do think, and to get back to the very first point that I made, we do really have to consider how everything we say can be taken out of context, and we're not responsible for that. But especially for those of us for whom that happens all the time, we sort of owe to pay back a little bit of explanation and resisting that stuff, so that at least even if we can't prevent that from happening and for this information from being used for nefarious purposes, at least we can help combat it after the fact.
With demographic education, and I think it wins on its merits. But it's not just demographics 101 of explaining what fertility means and what mortality means and what immigration means and how the arithmetic works and all that sort of stuff. And that'd be great if we could get that far. But it's also looking at our own demographics and not leaving things to hide in plain sight. We've got 20 million maybe invisible felons who are not behind bars because we don't bother to count people with that status. We've got this problem of stagnating educational levels, which we don't bother to talk about or even ask about why it's happening. We've got this problem of the men without work thing that I keep on getting at, which was more or less outside of policy discussion for almost 2 generations. So we can do more by going through the ABCs, but we can also do better work about what's happening in our society, and maybe that'll reduce some of the panic as well.
a quick comment on more flexible work arrangements. Philip?
They're good. We should have more of them. There is research suggesting that flexible work arrangements do actually increase birth rates. So there was a study in Germany looking at expansions of DSL among highly educated women who are more likely to have fast internet, right?
Yeah.
Which is not fast now. We would say that's slow internet, but it was fast at the time it was implemented. This increased the share who worked from home, and it increased the birth rate because it turns out it's easier to watch a kid from home than the office. So it's great. We should have more of it. Big fan. I work from home.
And on that note, I want to thank the panelists for a wonderful discussion. I'm sure they'll stay for a few minutes to answer some of your questions, but thank you all for coming for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.